England likes to tell itself a story about freedom to roam. Public footpaths stitched across every county, ancient rights of way that no landowner may quietly erase, a nation of hedgerows and stiles that anyone in theory may wander through, except of course when it cannot. There are places in this country, some of them enormous, some of them older than the idea of England itself, where the gate is locked, the sign is red, and the land simply does not belong to you, no matter how thoroughly English you happen to be. Some of these places belong to the Crown, some to the government, some to the army, and one or two simply to families who have never much cared to share. This is the story of 11 of them. Come on, subscribe, and let's begin. Number 11, Broadlands in Hampshire. From the road, Broadlands looks like every other handsome Georgian pile beside a river. In this case, the River Test, one of the finest chalk streams for trout fishing anywhere on earth. Capability Brown had a hand in the grounds in the 18th century, and it shows in the way the land seems to have been arranged rather than merely grown. The house belonged for generations to the Mountbatten family, and it was here in 1947 that a young Princess Elizabeth and her new husband Prince Philip spent the first days of their honeymoon at the invitation of his uncle, Earl Mountbatten. 34 years later, in 1981, another young royal couple did exactly the same thing. Broadlands has, by that reckoning, hosted the beginning of 2 royal marriages, which is not a bad line for an estate most people outside Hampshire have never heard of. What makes Broadlands forbidden is not scandal or secrecy in any dramatic sense. It is simply ownership exercised with a very English quietness. The house opens to the public for a handful of weeks each summer. Guided tour only, timed entry, no wandering off the marked route. For the other 10 months of the year, it reverts to what it has always really been underneath the history. A private family home, currently held by the family of Norton Knatchbull, with an accident of royal history attached to it rather like a wing added on. The wider estate, several thousand acres of parkland, water meadows and farmland running along the river, is entirely closed to the public, full stop. Fishing rights on that particular stretch of the Test are among the most sought after and exclusive in the country, passed quietly between people who, generally speaking, already know one another rather well. There is no fence topped with razor wire here, no soldier on the gate, just a very old, very English kind of privacy, the sort that does not need to explain itself because everyone involved already understands the rules without being told twice. It is worth adding that Broadlands very nearly became something quite different. In the 1970s, there was serious talk of opening the wider estate to a much larger commercial audience, following the fashion set by other stately homes that had turned to safari parks and funfair rides to keep the roof from falling in. The family declined. Whatever else you might say about the arrangement, they seem to have decided, quite deliberately, that a little privacy was worth rather more than the money that would come from giving it up. Number 10, Elveden Estate, Suffolk, 22,500 acres of Breckland Heath and dark pine forest, owned since 1894 by the Guinness family, the Earls of Iveragh, who bought it with brewing money and have kept it in the family ever since. On the surface, Elveden is a shooting estate, and a formidable one, among the largest and most productive driven game estates in the whole of Europe, famous in certain circles for pheasant drives that draw guests from across the world, each one paying handsomely for a single day's sport. Underneath that reputation, Elveden carries a stranger and rather less advertised history. In 1915 and 1916, this quiet, sandy corner of Suffolk became one of the most closely guarded secrets in wartime Britain. The Landships Committee, the group tasked with developing what the world would soon learn to call the tank, needed somewhere flat, private and entirely unobserved to test their new and rather terrifying machines. Elveden's open heathland, ringed by forest and far from prying eyes, suited the purpose perfectly. Early prototypes, clanking and half-finished, rumbled across ground where pheasants are now driven high over the heads of well-dressed guests, most of whom have not the faintest idea that a century earlier the same soil was churned up by the first armoured fighting vehicles in human history. There is something almost funny about that if you think about it for long enough. I have thought about it for rather a long time. Most of the estate remains closed to the public today, gated, gamekeepered, worked by a private staff answerable to a family that has held this land for well over 130 years. You can drive along the A11 that cuts straight through the middle of it and glimpse the pine plantations flashing past your window. You will not, under any circumstances, be invited past them. The estate also has a quieter, sadder chapter attached to it. Elveden was once home to Maharaja Duleep Singh, the last ruler of the Sikh Empire, exiled to England as a boy after the annexation of the Punjab, and raised in a sense as an honorary English country gentleman on this very land. He is buried in the churchyard at St Andrew and St Patrick. Just outside the walls of the estate he was never quite permitted to feel entirely at home on, which strikes me as its own small quiet lesson about what forbidden really means if you sit with it long enough. Number 9, Chevening House, Kent. Chevening is one of the odder arrangements in English public life, and I say that as someone who has seen a great many odd arrangements. It is not quite royal, not quite governmental, and not quite properly private, and that peculiar in-between status somehow makes it more restricted than any single one of the three would be on its own. Under an Act of Parliament passed in 1959, the Chevening Estate Act if you want the proper name for it, the house was gifted to the nation by the 7th Earl Stanhope on the condition that it be used as the official residence of a senior government minister, or alternatively a member of the royal family, whichever the sitting Prime Minister happened to nominate. For most of the last few decades that has meant the Foreign Secretary. The house itself is a serene, symmetrical 17th century mansion designed with the help of Inigo Jones, and the grounds run to some 3,500 acres of classic Kent parkland, lakes, ancient woodland, deer grazing where they have grazed for centuries. None of it is open to the public in any meaningful way ever. It is in effect a stately home permanently occupied by whoever happens to be running the nation's foreign policy at any given time, complete with the sort of security detail you would expect for exactly that. A great many quiet diplomatic conversations have taken place behind those walls over the decades, conversations that never once made the newspapers precisely because Chevening was designed deliberately for that kind of discretion. There is something almost comic in a house that belongs, technically and on paper, to the entire nation, remaining a place the nation itself is absolutely forbidden from ever setting foot inside. The gardens were laid out in part by Capability Brown, the same restless genius who touched half the great estates in this list one way or another, and there is an old walled garden on the grounds that supplies, quite genuinely, much of the produce served at the house. Somewhere out there, in other words, a minister of the Crown is very possibly eating a Chevening tomato while deciding matters of considerable international importance, and none of us will ever be invited to see either the tomato or the decision being made. Number 8, Otterburn Training Area, Northumberland. Nearly 23,000 acres of the Northumberland National Park belong, in every practical sense that matters, to the Ministry of Defence. Live firing has taken place across this ground since 1911, which makes Otterburn considerably older than either of the world wars it went on to serve, and it remains very much active today. Artillery, mortars and small arms are fired across this landscape on a regular basis, and when the red flags are raised on the surrounding hilltops, walkers on the nearby footpaths are turned back at the boundary rope, sometimes mid-stride, sometimes rather firmly. What makes Otterburn genuinely strange is that it sits, quite deliberately, inside a national park. Land that is, by every ordinary definition the word carries, meant to belong to everybody equally, and for roughly 2/3 of the calendar year. In a fashion, it does. The Ministry of Defence and Northumberland National Park Authority maintain an uneasy, carefully negotiated truce, opening certain marked footpaths on confirmed non-firing days and slamming them shut again the instant a red flag goes up on the flagpole. The result is one of the more unusual patches of England you will find anywhere. Heather moorland of genuine striking natural beauty, home to some of the last surviving black grouse leks in the entire country, routinely interrupted by the crack and rumble of live artillery fire somewhere over the next ridge. The land is littered, if you know precisely where and how to look, with the rusted remains of shell casings, decades old, half buried in the peat, Beautiful and lethal are not words that usually share a sentence about the English countryside. At Otterburn, rather unavoidably, they do. Local farmers whose land borders the range have learned over generations to read the flags the way their grandfathers read the weather. A habit of mine passed down as casually as knowing which fields flood in winter. Visitors have no such instinct, which is precisely why the warning boards at every access point are so blunt in their wording. Unexploded ordnance has turned up here on more than one occasion, decades after it was fired, quietly waiting in the peat for someone with rather less local knowledge to come along. Number 7, Foulness Island, Essex. Foulness sits low and flat at the mouth of the Thames estuary, connected to the mainland by a single narrow causeway that floods at high tide and is, in any case, permanently guarded and gated. The island has belonged to the Ministry of Defence in one form or another since the First World War, and it remains today an active site of weapons testing carried out by the defence contractor Kinetic. Explosive ordnance, artillery shells and experimental munitions have been tested across its salt marsh and mudflats for well over 100 years, and the work has never really stopped. Roughly 150 people still live on Foulness, mostly farming families whose ancestors were settled there long before the ministry ever arrived, and who now require an official permit simply to drive themselves home each evening. The rest of England is kept firmly out by checkpoints, by the tides, and by the occasional distant detonation echoing flatly across the marshland. There is a small church on the island, St Mary the Virgin, mostly locked and rarely used, and a scattering of very old farmhouses standing in isolation, and beyond them marshland that has quietly swallowed unexploded ordnance for a full century and shows absolutely no interest in giving any of it back. Foulness is, quite literally, an island kept apart from the rest of the country by its own government, which strikes me as a peculiarly English way of arranging things when you consider it plainly. Curiously, Foulness once had ambitions far grander than a weapons range. In the early 1970s, the government seriously considered the island as the site for a brand new London airport, an alternative to Heathrow, complete with its own purpose-built seaport and city for 250,000 people. The plan was abandoned in 1974, largely on cost, and the island returned to what it has always quietly been, one of the least visited, most heavily restricted patches of ground anywhere within sight of London. If you've made it this far and you're still with me, a like tells YouTube there are more of us than they think. Number 6, Stanford Training Area, Norfolk. STANTA, to the soldiers who train there. In June 1942, with invasion still feared and training ground desperately needed, the War Office requisitioned some 30,000 acres of the Norfolk Brecks in a single stroke of administrative decisiveness. 6 villages, Tottington, Stamford, Sturston, West Toffs, Buckingham Toffs and part of Langford, were given a matter of weeks' notice. Something in the region of 1,000 people were told, politely but with no room for negotiation, to leave their homes for the duration of the war effort. The war, as wars do, eventually ended. The villagers, as it turned out, never went back. What remains today is one of the strangest places in the whole of England, a training estate the size of a small town, still owned entirely by the Ministry of Defence, where the shells of those 6 villages still stand, deliberately preserved and periodically reinforced as a mock urban battlefield for soldiers to fight through. Troops have trained here for the deserts of Iraq and the streets of Belfast alike, moving through churches with no congregations left in them, houses with no families left inside them, all set within a landscape that ordinary visitors are absolutely forbidden to enter without a military escort on pain of prosecution and, frankly, considerable personal risk. Once a year, on a single supervised day, descendants of the evacuated families are permitted a carefully managed visit, laying flowers at St Mary's Church in Tottington, the one building on the whole estate still treated with something approaching reverence. For the other 364 days of the year, the villages belong to no one but the army, and to the deer, which have multiplied wonderfully, undisturbed across 80 years of land that officially wants nothing whatsoever to do with the public. There is a curious irony to STANTA that the ministry itself seems to appreciate, because no farming, no development and no casual public access has been permitted here for over 80 years. The training area has become, by accident, one of the most important refuges for rare Breckland wildlife in the whole of England. Stone curlews, adders and plants found almost nowhere else in the country thrive precisely because the place is forbidden. Conservation and live artillery fire coexisting on the same 30,000 acres rather uneasily and rather successfully. Number 5. Imber, Wiltshire. If STANTA is Norfolk's ghost estate, Imber is Wiltshire's, and its story runs almost identically down to the very month. In November 1943, the villagers of Imber, some families genuinely traceable back to the Domesday Book of 1086, which is not a claim many English villages can honestly make, were given a mere 47 days to pack up and leave. The Salisbury Plain Training Area needed the village urgently for street fighting exercises ahead of what would become the Normandy landings. They were promised in good faith at the time that they could return once the war was over. They were never allowed back. A determined campaign by former residents in the 1950s got as far as a formal legal challenge, which they ultimately lost, and Imber has remained Ministry of Defence property ever since. Its parish church, St Giles, is kept in careful, almost eerie repair by a dedicated preservation trust, standing pristine amid a village, otherwise rebuilt again and again as concrete shells purely for urban combat training, deliberately blown apart, patched back together and blown apart once more, in an endless cycle that has nothing to do with worship and everything to do with rehearsal. The road through Imber, and occasionally the village itself, opens to the public for perhaps 50 days a year, generally around Christmas and the August bank holiday, when firing pauses out of what I suppose you might call seasonal courtesy. The rest of the time, red flags fly, live rounds are fired down streets where families once tucked their children into bed for the night, and one of England's oldest continuously recorded villages remains, by force of law, a place its own descendants may only visit according to the ministry's calendar rather than their own wishes. Every so often a story does the rounds about the villagers being allowed home for good, and every so often it turns out, on closer inspection, to be nothing more than hope dressed up as news. The most recent promise of that kind was made during the war itself, by a government official standing in the village square, telling the assembled residents that this was strictly temporary. 80 years on, temporary has become one of the longer words in the English language. If this has whetted your appetite for the hidden and the forbidden, there is more where this came from. I'll leave a link at the end. Number 4, Highgrove House, Gloucestershire. Highgrove has served as the King's private home since 1980, long before he ever wore the crown. Back when he was simply the Prince of Wales looking for somewhere quiet in the Cotswolds to call his own, it remains one of the most fiercely protected estates in the country, not for military reasons this time, but for reasons of simple, determined, deliberate privacy. The house itself has never once been opened for public tours, not in over 4 decades, and by all accounts is not likely to start now. The gardens, however, are a different matter entirely and a rather curious compromise. Since 1996, sections of the grounds, organically managed since long before organic farming was fashionable, famously eccentric, filled with topiary, the King is said to have shaped with a good deal of personal involvement over the years, have been opened by pre-booked guided tour only, tickets selling out months in advance, cameras and phones confiscated politely but firmly at the entrance gate. It is perhaps the only royal estate in the whole of England where you may walk freely through the garden and never once glimpse the house that gives the whole place its name. A solid wall of clipped yew hedge doing precisely the job it was planted decades ago to do. Beyond the ornamental gardens lies the working estate proper, nearly 1,000 acres of home farm, run on organic principles since the early 1980s, well before that particular word meant very much to anyone outside a fairly narrow circle. None of it, not 1 acre of it, is accessible without an invitation that very few people are ever fortunate enough to receive. The privacy is enforced with a rather modern degree of thoroughness. Visitors on the garden tour are asked to hand over phones and cameras at the entrance, precisely and specifically so that no unauthorised image of the house itself, glimpsed accidentally over a hedge, ever finds its way onto the internet. It is, by some distance, the most photographed private garden in England, and simultaneously one of the least photographed private houses, a distinction achieved entirely on purpose. Number 3. Frogmore Estate, Windsor Great Park, Berkshire. Most people who have heard of Frogmore know it chiefly as the site of a rather well-publicised wedding reception back in 2018. Rather fewer know that Frogmore has been one of the most consistently private corners of the entire Windsor estate since the 18th century, when Queen Charlotte first began using the house as a genuinely personal retreat, a place to escape, if you can believe it, even from the demands of her own husband's court. Frogmore House sits within the far wider expanse of Windsor Great Park, itself running to several thousand acres, much of which is closed entirely to visitors, discreetly patrolled and dotted with a scattering of private royal residences, including Royal Lodge and Adelaide Cottage. The Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore, the resting place of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, opens to the general public precisely one day each year by advance ticket only, and even then only weather and royal scheduling permitting. For the remaining 364 days of the calendar, Frogmore remains exactly what it was quietly designed to be 2.5 centuries ago. A place for the family, behind the family, a garden tucked inside a park, tucked inside an estate, 3 careful layers of privacy stacked neatly one on top of the other, situated in the middle of a town that otherwise welcomes well over 1 million tourists every single year, most of them content simply to photograph the castle from a respectful and entirely public distance. The wider grounds of Windsor Great Park do allow walkers along certain marked routes, past the Copper Horse statue and down the Long Walk, and it is quite possible to spend a pleasant afternoon there without ever quite realising how much of the land to either side remains firmly closed. That, I think, is rather the intended effect. The public route is generous enough that nobody feels excluded, while somehow managing to reveal almost nothing of what lies just beyond the tree line. Number 2, Sandringham Estate, Norfolk. The private core of it, at least, since parts of it do open. Sandringham's formal gardens and museum open to the public for much of the year, which makes it dangerously easy to forget just how much of the wider estate never does. Not once, not for anybody. 20,000 acres in total, and the true working heart of it, the tenant farms, the shooting grounds, and above all, wood farm. The deliberately modest cottage on the property that has served as a genuinely private royal retreat for several generations now, remains entirely off limits to outsiders year-round, without exception. Wood Farm is, by royal standards, an almost embarrassingly ordinary house, which is rather precisely its appeal to the family that uses it. Prince Philip spent much of his final years living there, deliberately set apart from the grander main house half a mile up the drive by his own choice. When the family gathers at Sandringham over Christmas and walks to church on Boxing Day past hundreds of well-wishers lining the route, the cameras manage to capture perhaps 200 yards of a 20,000-acre estate. The other 19,999 and 3/4 acres carry on entirely unseen, farmed steadily, shot over in season, and quietly lived in by people the rest of us will, in all likelihood, never once meet. Sandringham has been in royal hands since 1862, bought by Queen Victoria for her son, later Edward VII, specifically because it was considered private enough for a young prince with a certain reputation to enjoy without every detail of his behaviour reaching London by morning post. Whether it entirely succeeded in that original aim is a question I shall leave to the historians. What is certain is that the same instinct for a quiet, well-guarded retreat has been carried faithfully down through 5 generations since. Number 1, Chequers, Buckinghamshire, which brings us, rather fittingly, to the most forbidden estate of the lot. Chequers has served as the official country residence of the Prime Minister since 1921, when it was gifted to the nation by Sir Arthur Lee and his wife Ruth, on the rather touching belief that future Prime Ministers ought to have somewhere quiet to think, well away from what Lee himself described, in his own slightly barbed words, as men not born to affluence. Every Prime Minister since Lloyd George has made use of the house, some considerably more than others. The house itself dates back to the 16th century, and its walls have absorbed a great deal of history that never once made it into any official record. Wartime strategy sessions under Churchill conducted long into the night, quiet diplomatic breakthroughs reached over long weekends, and if certain persistent stories are to be believed, at least one American president gently persuaded to change his mind entirely over the course of a single English lunch. None of that is fully verifiable, of course. That is rather the whole point of Chequers. What happens inside those walls generally does not leave them. The estate itself, some 1,500 acres of Chiltern woodland and farmland, is fenced, patrolled and watched over by a permanent detachment of the Metropolitan Police alongside the military. Public footpaths do cross parts of the surrounding land, and on a clear day you can see the house itself from a respectful distance up on Coombe Hill, a popular local walking spot. You will get no closer than that view allows. It is quietly and almost without anyone remarking on it the most secure and least visited great house in the whole of England, precisely because the person living inside it at any given moment happens to be the one individual in the entire country that just about everybody would most like to have a private word with. There is a tradition, observed by most incoming Prime Ministers, of signing the visitor's book at Chequers and leaving some small written reflection on the burdens of the office, sometimes solemn, occasionally rather funny. Those pages are not published and are unlikely ever to be, which means that somewhere inside that house sits perhaps the most candid, unpublished record of modern British political history, written by the very people who lived it and locked, appropriately enough, behind the same gates as everything else on this list. 11 estates then, each forbidden for its own particular reason, a royal garden behind a wall of yew, a village blown up on purpose and rebuilt and blown up again, an island that has spent a century quietly testing explosives under the noses of its own farmers, a house built in the end for one man's peace of mind and every subsequent tenant's security. Different reasons, every single one of them: crown, government, army, simple inherited money, but very much the same instinct sitting underneath all of it. England has never quite trusted the idea of land belonging equally to everyone, no matter how convincingly the public footpaths might suggest otherwise. Somewhere behind nearly every hedge in this country, if you look closely enough, there is a gate, and someone somewhere quietly holding the key to it. I have walked past a good many of these gates myself over the years, and never once been let in, which I suppose is exactly as it should be. I am a grandfather now, and grandfathers, I find, worry rather more than they used to. Do take good care of yourselves.